We met Harvey very, very early on, and I read some of his papers, and I was sort of, I said to Tom, oh my gosh, maybe we've been scooped. Because where we had gone from initially laying out the theory in the first book in 1990, we met Harvey about 92 or 93. And what he was interested in were these issues about sort of how emotional rituals are and exciting they are. And he too sort of saw that there seemed to be these two attractor positions, to use the language that we routinely use.
So what seems similar is two hypotheses about how you could explain what seems to be this random diversity in religious ritual forms. In fact, is not random. You've got attractors. You can put various types of rituals along various spectrums, right? So that seems to be the similar features of the two theories.
Absolutely. If you think of a sort of a large abstract space of possible ritual arrangements, it turns out things aren't scattered all over that space. Right. They tend to cluster in a couple of places. They're in other places, and that's an interesting issue all in and of itself, but won't bore you with that. But the notion that there are two attractors, and Whitehouse certainly had come to that view, and as we had.
And in his view, what are the two attractors? The two.
Well, in short, his view is that this issue about sort of the language we've used and seems to have stuck is sort of the levels of sensory pageantry associated with a ritual. There are these rituals that you do all the time, the ones I called earlier, the ones we're tempted to call mindless ritual, tend to be the low pageantry ones. They aren't as exciting. You just, you go put your hand in the font, you put some water, and you cross yourself, and you walk on. This is not like a full immersion baptism, for example, okay, where you're in a special robe and so on.
Everyone's there.
Yeah, exactly. And we suggested that it was considerations of ritual form that distinguished these hot spots. Harvey Whitehouse had in some ways, frankly, a simpler theory on this front. And that I mean that as a compliment, by the way. I mean, it's always good to have simple theories.
Simpler in a scientific sense, yeah.
And that is that this was overwhelmingly a function of simple frequency. That is to say that it's, in fact, the frequency that explains the level of sensory pageantry, rather than our argument that it's form that explains both frequency and sensory pageantry. Right. Okay? Right. And this led to an effort to, and frankly was the motivation for the second book that Tom and I collaborated on, because, this is the honest truth. We have a theory, we're plumping for that theory, we hope it wins and all, but one thing that we saw for sure, and what was even more important to us, is that the cognitive science of religion had real empirical issues at stake, that it was an attempt to really try to sort of bring scientific approaches to the study of these materials. And so when we wrote the second book, what we were out to do was to show that we had two competing theories about a body of phenomena that they largely agreed about. And so, as is almost always the case in science, what you have to do to really tease apart theories that can explain most of the obvious stuff is to go create or find extraordinary environments where some of the variables are under control in ways that you don't get in normal environments, and you can then see if the theories, and particularly what we're interested in is looking where theories have conflicting predictions.
Yeah, so you want to create environments where the theories would have different predictions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or find them.
Or find them.
Right. I mean, experimental work is where you create them.
Yeah.
Empirical but non-experimental work is where you simply try to go out and find them in nature and see if there's interesting test cases there. Harvey Whitehouse wrote one of the most riveting and wonderful ethnographies I have ever read, and I admire it hugely. The long and the short of it is that he was involved with a group that had a sort of form roughly like a cargo cult. In other words, a kind of religious system that seemed to have emerged in the 20th century across a great deal of the South Pacific and Micronesia and Melanesia and Polynesia, I think, as well, but mostly Melanesia, where they were in effect kind of millennial groups that expected the return, dovetailing with their traditional religious systems, they expected the return of their ancestors who would bring them tremendous amounts of cargo. They had by now contact, and especially on the basis of World War II, had contact with nations that had what, to their eyes, and were genuinely massive amounts of wealth. And they were quite puzzled about why it was that, these folks had all this stuff, and, we're the good guys, and we didn't do anything, and we don't have this stuff. And so the big issue, though, for these is always, when are the ancestors going to return with the cargo?
Right.
And so Harvey is in East New Britain Island, and with a group, and a couple of fellows have some ecstatic experiences, and one fellow in particular says that, I've, in effect, I'm hoping I'm getting these precise details right, but in effect, got good reason to think that the ancestors are going to come back soon if we can sort of straighten up our act. And at a certain point, there's ritual innovation, and that's really one of the major focuses of Harvey's book. What is the character of the innovation? And at least, in short, to try to make the story fairly quick, at a certain point, they've decided that if we simply do this one very, very, and it turns out it's this, sort of particular ritual at night, high arousal ritual, exactly. This is it. This is going to get the ancestors to come back, and we're going to have all the cargo in the world tomorrow. And the long and the short of it is that what happens, of course, is the ancestors don't come back. So then you have problems about how we're going to explain, well, did we do the ritual wrong? Or was there some failing on our part? Or it turns out at one point somebody falls in the middle of, because you have to repeat this over and over and over again, but it's a non-repeatable ritual. Yeah. Okay, so why would you repeat it? Well, it failed. Well, why did it fail? Well, it failed, again, for those reasons. And in one case, it turns out after they've done it a few nights, one particular individual falls down, and the general judgment is this person is possessed, and is possessed with a demon or something. And so this is the person who has messed up the ritual and kept the ancestors from coming back, and so on. Well, what happens is if you do this night after night, not only are you exhibiting your failure to get the ancestors back, but at a certain level it kind of starts taking on an air of familiarity. And so if you want people to keep coming back, you've got to keep turning up the volume. And in fact, that's exactly what Harvey documents over about a 6-week period. Okay, so what we're talking about is higher levels of sensory pageantry, yet it's repeated every night.
Which is unusual.
And the argument that we made was, therefore, it can't be a function of frequency. It's got to be a function of form. And that's why they're working so hard to explain why it failed. Because they have a view about the form that the ritual has. The question about frequency is it turns out it's a very complicated one, but in this case it's not quite so complicated. It can be a complicated one, but in this case it's simply the fact that a ritual that was allegedly needed to be only done once had to be done every night for 6 weeks. And it wasn't at the end of the 6 weeks suddenly they had success. It was suddenly that the whole system finally just collapsed. They had no more food to eat. They literally had to get out and solve the problems that they had neglected for those 6 weeks, awaiting as it were, the arrival of the ancestors with the cargo. Ritual form, if you recall, from what we've said earlier, is the argument that it depends on sort of where the CI agent is in the slot for the script for the ritual that people have in their heads. And the argument was, of course, in this case, is the gods were going to do something, the ancestors, were going to do something to them, namely, save them. Okay? And if that's the case, the ancestors only need to do it once. Okay? But yet you get repetition. Well, then there's an argument about why repetition how that could happen on the ritual form hypothesis. Well, the answer is going to have to be people had better be making some excuse for why they're doing it again, because they understand they shouldn't need to do it again.
Yeah.
Okay? And conversely, it's done every night for 6 weeks. That's a pretty high level of frequency. Well, on Harvey's view, the greater the frequency, the lower the level of sensory pageantry. But in fact, the frequency involved higher levels of sensory pageantry.
And you feel like the ritual form hypothesis explains that this is a good test case, because
Yes,
here you'd expect
exactly.
that the increased, if it's about frequency alone, the increased frequency should be lowering the pageantry,
Exactly.
lowering the arousal. But in
Exactly.
fact, it's getting ramped up wildly, which seems then to actually fit the forms theory better. So people are having this arousal reaction because the expectation aroused by the CI, the counterintuitive agent, has not materialized. We should only have to do this once. Why? Because the ancestors, gods, are doing something to us. It didn't work. We have to do it again. That's really unusual. And we're going to have to keep ramping it up to get people to keep engaging in this ritual that really shouldn't be repeated at all.
Yeah, and I would stress a further feature about this, and that is that if you're in this situation, there's a need to tell a story. You've got to give an account. Why is it we're doing this again?
Yeah.
Right? This is not a normal situation. Doesn't conform in effect with our representation of what the ritual is. Okay. Harvey has gone on to do and continued to do magnificent work, enlisting a number of extremely talented people to just look at a number of different features of the larger encompassing theory, his so-called modes theory, of religion. In lots and lots of settings and arrangements, and the work is just terrific. Our interests kind of got stuck on this interesting conundrum about special agent rituals, and so for the next, and I had fewer resources, for the next 10 years or so, what I started looking at was, how do religions solve this problem about the fact that these special agent rituals are the ones that tend to get people excited and involved and engaged and motivated, and yet by their very nature, by their very forms, they're only done once. So it looks like that's a terrific resource that you can't take much advantage of. So have religions, as it were, evolved in ways to figure out ways to take advantage of these? Well, why are they ever repeated? Well, we saw one case, we've just discussed it, and that is they failed. But that's not so good. Your God looks pretty powerless or fickle, or your ritual leader looks fairly incompetent, so that's not so great. Well, they can be reversed, divorces. But of course that also doesn't carry a terribly happy taste in your mouth typically, especially if we're involved with the whole group and getting these things reversed. And in fact, it turns out reversals are pretty rare, other than divorce. And that's a very recent phenomenon in my own lifetime, there has been a fundamental change in that in American society. But, are there other ways that you might be able to sort of pull this off? And the long and the short of it is that Tom Lawson and I saw, as we were writing Bringing Ritual to Mind, we saw one other possibility out there. And we started looking around for it. And then we started asking folks, does anybody know a religion where this sort of framework exists? And that is where people get to serve as substitutes in special agent rituals.
Okay.
So that means you could do it again.
Okay.
Right? But you're not doing it for your own sake. You're doing it for someone else's sake, because you're substituting for them. And so the God's going to do it to you. He's going to baptize you, for example. But it's not really you that's being baptized.
Okay.
It's someone else.
So these rituals where there's a counterintuitive agent who's doing something to you have a lot of pageantry, they're very exciting, they can't happen very often. They can only happen to you as a patient once. And as you've talked about, they're sometimes potentially reversible, but that doesn't happen very much. They sometimes fail. That's also undesirable for a variety of reasons. But because they have this power, it would be beneficial for religions to be able to use them more frequently.
Yeah, it's a problem that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. You've in fact just right now tracked through a couple of the options that were out there. Was quite struck coming out of the gate of King's College, Cambridge in England, and learning that the church right down the way had been consecrated and unconsecrated and reconsecrated and unconsecrated and reconsecrated. So reversals, right?
Yeah.
But that's pretty laborious and not so cool. But there were two solutions that seemed to me to be rather more promising and very, very interesting. One is one that is out there in the world, though my own familiarity with it arises actually principally from an ethnography, namely Frederick Barth's Ritual and Knowledge Among the Bhaktaman. And in short, what Barth discusses is the fact that the Bhaktaman males go through 7 degrees of initiation. So in other words, instead of just having one initiation, let's have 7 of them. And they do it across about a 20-year period. So it's spaced out in a way that, and it continues to, build solidarity amongst those males. That's a small-scale society. Okay. Is that solution out there anywhere? Well, it is in some religions. There's sort of ranks. And so that's one way of handling it. But an even better solution, it seemed to me, or let's put it this way, at least as good, and I think in some ways better, is the possibility that there might be substitution in ritual. That is to say that you go through a special agent ritual another time as its patient, but you don't do it for yourself. You're standing in, you are substituting for someone else. And quite literally, I stood up at sessions in which I was speaking at the American Academy of Religion, at the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion, and so on, and asked rooms full of scholars of religion, does anybody know a religion that has this, so to speak, this arrangement? Now, candidly, I was aware of the fact, because Tom and I had found out, there's at least one, and that's the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints. And then, of course, this was immediately intriguing to us because of Rodney Stark's work, in which basically Rodney Stark is arguing that we're witnessing something that's unprecedented for 1,300 years, namely the birth of a new world religion. Because, why does he say that? Because the growth rates of the LDS Church have been just phenomenal, exactly. Not the least here in America. After all, a presidential candidate was a member of the LDS Church just 4 years ago in the United States. Well, what's the ritual? Well, the ritual is one that the Mormons are well known for. It's a ritual that Joseph Smith, as my understanding and what I've read about this, is that Joseph Smith is indeed the person who invented this ritual. So, I am willing to say something that lots of people in sort of mainline Christian groups are sort of surprised, but I think that you have to understand that at certain levels Joseph Smith was a religious genius. That ritual is the baptism of the dead. The baptism of the dead in the LDS Church is, as it were, a means for producing more members of the LDS Church. This is why the LDS Church also has one of the world's most extensive bodies of information about genealogies. Because current members of the LDS Church are anxious, among other things, to make sure that their ancestors are included in the fold. If they can track ancestors back prior to the arrival of the LDS Church, the emergence of the LDS Church, obviously these folks, had no opportunity to become members. But what this means, among other things, is that members of the LDS Church who've achieved a certain level of rank, so to speak, within the religious hierarchy, specifically they're permitted to go into the temples, and not all members of the LDS Church are permitted into LDS temples in the inner sanctums. Periodically, once or twice a year, these folks serve as substitutes in a cohort with other high-ranking members, which is to say a dozen or a couple dozen folks, or maybe more, will go through a day of substitutional baptisms, full immersion baptisms, doing it as a group together. And you do this, as I said, once, maybe twice a year. You don't do it more often, because if you did, people would habituate and it wouldn't be so exciting anymore. Yeah, right. That was the problem that Whitehouse's group that he was studying. They kept doing it over and over and over again, and so they had to keep turning up the excitement. Mm-hmm. This is an ideal mechanism for motivating members without risking habituation, mm-hmm. without risking any problems about the notion that that somehow God is inadequate and had to do the ritual again, or that the ritual officiant is inadequate. All of these problems get solved. So, I mean, I don't mean by any means, and in fact, what the number of mechanisms that you pointed to are just right, but this is one of them. And it was one that was discovered on the basis of us formulating the theory. Yeah. And we went out and we've, said, well, it looks to us like if you could solve this problem, it would be really great. And if here's a way of solving the problem, are there any religions that have solved this problem? There is one, and son of a gun, it's very done very, very well.
Yeah, no, that's great. So your theory actually predicted the existence of something that you weren't sure was out there.
Well, predicted that if it existed, it would have certain kinds of beneficial consequences that would seem to be disproportionate.
And that's what we actually seem to see in the world.
It does look like that. That's right.